final session of the day. So my name's Nicola Gladden. I'm one of the trustees of the Animal Welfare Foundation. I'm on the grants committee as well, so I'm very fortunate. I get to see all of the applications that we have, and some really excellent ones come across our desk. Unfortunately, we can't fund them all, but we do fund as much as we can, and we've got some presenting us today. So our first presentation from Laura is from a student researcher whose project was funded through the AWF student grant scheme. These annual grants support students to carry out animal welfare research projects, and many of them previously funded have gone on to become researchers and gained a deeper understanding of animal welfare as a result. The grants are a powerful and effective way of encouraging the next generation of welfare researchers and build a strongly welfare-focused profession. So I'd like to introduce Laura Simons, who's doing a BVsc Veterinary Science at the University of Bristol. And the title of her presentation is Confidence and Capability to Identify and Treat Stress in Horses.
Hey, so hi everyone, I'm Laura. I'm a vet student at the University of Bristol, and as Nicola said, I was very happy to receive the Animal Welfare Foundation Student Research Grant, and I am really privileged to be here today amongst such a distinguished line of delegates such as yourself to share a little bit about what I did with the grant and how the research has influenced me. So prior to vet school, I completed my bachelor's degree in neuroscience at Cardiff University, pursuing my interest in the connection between physical and mental health and how they contribute to overall quality of life. So my final year project focused on the affective component of pain. So when given the opportunity to conduct my own research related to animal welfare, exploring the affective or mental domain was an obvious choice. But why did I choose horses? Well, horses are unique in both their physiology and their management within modern society. So unique, in fact, that they have an entire branch of veterinary medicine dedicated to them. They have the anatomical and behavioural hallmarks of a prey species, lateral eye position, herbivory, and of course, formidable speed and endurance. But where the latter two once aided their escape from predation, now dictates their worth in many circumstances. In that sense, many of these animals are still running for their lives, as their ancestors did before them. I used racing as an example there, but in fact, as we've discussed today, several aspects of horse husbandry in general present considerable opportunity for poor welfare. So with all that in mind, horses were the perfect subject for my study. As we've established, recognizing stress is crucial to animal welfare, and when working with large animals like horses, to the safety of vets and paraprofessionals. Current evidence shows huge variation in stress response in horses. So how can we as vets address this, despite seeing them so infrequently? Is stress in horses simply an occupational hazard, or can we treat it as we do so without question when our patients present with physical ailments? I wanted to begin to answer a few of these questions by asking vets and vet students how they identify stress in horses, how they would attempt to reduce stress, and how confident they are in their answers. Confidence does not equate to a capability, of course, but it was important for me to ask these questions due to the often unyielding adherence to tradition seen both within horsemanship and equine veterinary medicine. As Nikki said, the way we've always done it is not always the right way. The survey consisted of a mix of multiple choice and short answer questions. This was in part for ease of analysis, but also to enable me to lure potential participants with the promise of a short questionnaire that takes no longer than 20 minutes to complete. After all, my target sample has notoriously little free time to spare. Short answers were grouped into themes, and as you can see, I was further able to categorize these themes according to behavioral, physiological, and pathological signs. In terms of what the stressed horse may present with, stereotypies was by far the most common answer, which is supported by current evidence. Some of you may notice that there is considerable overlap between the presenting signs of stress identified by participants and those of pain. Indeed, this is an area of significant research interest at the moment, and a theme that has cropped up several times in participants' answers throughout the survey and even today. From a veterinary perspective, we can see how some of these signs may manifest as clients presenting complaints, but whether related to stress or another pathological process, what we do next can have considerable consequences for emotional stress as well. So what these results show is that with the exception of orally administered medication, all participants believed that these common veterinary interventions could be stressful to varying extents. As I somewhat expected, the majority of participants stated that hospitalisation and box rest could be extremely stressful. I direct you all at this point to a short clinical commentary by equine vet and behaviour specialist Dr. Gemma Pearson, in which she discusses numerous ways that we can mitigate the stress associated with box rest. To that end, perhaps we do not need to accept stress as an inevitability, but educate ourselves in the myriad of stress-reducing tools at our disposal, and I was happy to see that this logic was reflected in some participants' responses. Many participants suggested adaptations to box rest, including a box-sized area within a paddock, with the aim of providing nose-to-nose contact with conspecifics, turnout, ad-lib access to forage, and capacity for normal behaviour. Having a rotation of conspecifics within a neighbouring stall to allow for nose-to-nose contact was also suggested. As for the day-to-day management of stress, presence of conspecifics was the most common answer, but the importance of forage, gentle handling, enrichment, and desensitisation training was also mentioned. As for psychopharmaceuticals, the vets' responses in particular were really interesting, where some would opt for trazodone, an anxiolytic, or ACP, a sedative, as a first-line treatment. Others stated they would only use as a last resort. Another interesting theme was that of twitching, and I didn't include a specific question about twitching, but I asked our participants what they would use to reduce stress in horses, and if there were anything that they'd seen previously that they disliked, and twitching cropped up in both of these categories. Research on twitching, fittingly, is equally as conflicting, but as of today, there appears to be no overly compelling evidence to support their use. Although studies have documented reduction in heart rate and sympathetic signs upon use of a lip twitch, these effects have been shown to reverse after prolonged use. Where is the boundary between acceptable and prolonged use? We don't know, and in my opinion, while the jury is still out on the use of this tool, it should not be taught as an acceptable method of restraint or stress management in veterinary practice. Apologies to the vets in the room who will probably sigh if I quote from the RCVS list of day one competencies, so I'll paraphrase. New graduates are expected to be able to analyse best available evidence for procedures used and reflect on performance in support of practising evidence-based veterinary medicine. Furthermore, use of the twitch and presumptuous or inappropriate use of psychopharmaceuticals neglects the value of learning theory knowledge, something that Gemma Pearson teaches at the University of Edinburgh. The purpose of my study was not to draw conclusions that could be generalised to a wider population per se, but one of the most damning conclusions from this study cohort was that both vets and vet students cited non-professional experience as their most popular answer for what has most significantly informed their knowledge of horse stress signals. This presents a serious issue, as this is something that vet schools and professional bodies have no control over. If they are indeed reflective of the wider population, something that I hope will be addressed in future larger scale studies, this perhaps suggests the need to revise veterinary school curriculums and CPD programs regarding emotional stress in horses. Although we cannot undervalue the benefits of non-professional experience such as horse ownership or volunteering, every vet student has the right to expect to learn all day one skills from their veterinary degree. Furthermore, the majority of participants in this study expressed interest in learning more about stress in horses. So just to finish with a little bit what I got from the project, some of the participants in my study included behaviour and welfare specialists and vets who had been practising for over 30 years, so as a vet student I was incredibly grateful to read and analyse their responses. Events like this one today are great because we are a room of like-minded individuals with an interest in animal welfare. But this study offered insight outside of the echo chamber, as it were, into UK vets and vet students who had attended different schools and had completely different experiences from myself. And as so eloquently alluded to by Joe White and Sophie Lewis of Human Behaviour Change for Life at last year's discussion forum, we can only improve animal welfare by understanding the behaviour of those who think differently from us. To that end, this project gave me an enormous sense of accomplishment, bringing together animal welfare research and real-world decision-making. This was also my first time grappling with qualitative data, and let's just say I take my hats off to those of you in the room that do this on a daily basis. I now leave you with an example of just how stress-free something like an injection or a blood sample can be. I'm going to show you a short video, and the woman in the video is Melanie Watson, an animal behaviourist specialising in force-free training. I did my preclinical equine placement with her in my first year. Through positive reinforcement, she has turned her rescue horse, Magic, from an animal that had injured vets and farriers, required sedation at every visit, and was even recommended for euthanasia on behavioural grounds, to the horse that you see in the video today. So she starts off by pinching the skin to simulate the feeling of an injection. And in short, he was trained to stay completely still for 10 seconds to allow for a vet to administer an injection or take a blood sample. She's using a blunt needle there on the skin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was a really excellent presentation. We're not taking questions for the student presentations, but Laura has said if anybody's got any questions, she'll be happy to speak to you afterwards. In addition to student grants, the AWF has invested over £2.3 million into funding major research projects on serious animal welfare issues across a variety of species. And during the last 3 years, we've been funding research under our Breeding for Better Welfare theme and building a body of evidence covering breeding, welfare issues in companion and farmed species. And now we've got an update from one of these projects from Dr. Siobhan Abeyesinghe, whose research was awarded in 2021. And Siobhan is the Associate Professor in Animal Behaviour and Welfare Science at the Royal Veterinary College and is going to speak on breeding for better broiler welfare, balancing sustainability, economic and consumer preferences. And there will be chance for questions after this talk, both Slido and with the roving mics as well. Siobhan.
Thank you, Nicola. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful to AWF and also the British Poultry Council for funding this research. I have a lot to cover in the project, covered more than this. We're just going to cover a little bit, a small part of the research that we did. And for background, the welfare concerns about fast-growing conventional broilers has led a number of welfare charities to campaign for food service companies, retailers and restaurant chains to commit to improving broiler chicken welfare by 2026 by improving rearing environments and utilising slower growing birds. Oh, and this seems to have skipped to the next stage. So we conducted a online survey and focus groups to try and identify a knowledge gap where consumers, about consumers' views on potential trade-offs between the economic, environmental and welfare impacts of using these slower growing birds as they live longer, use more food and use more energy. And so, as you can see, we found that there was very poor knowledge in consumers about poultry production in general, and they held many incorrect beliefs, including that broiler chickens are hatched by their mothers, reared in cages and have outdoor access, and also that they're reared using antibiotics and growth hormones. And our focus groups respondents were consistent, their views were consistent with this, so they also felt that poultry production was at mass scale and that commonly used was antibiotics and hormones, and some even felt that there was genetic modification going on. And I'm okay to go to that. So we gave them the example of a small value chicken available in a supermarket, well-known supermarket at the time, at the cost of £4 and asked their views on this. They felt that this was too cheap for chicken, and their views around production of cheap chicken were associated with poor quality, poor welfare, and concerns around risks to human health, standards involving corner cutting. But they also recognised the challenges of producing affordable meat at scale and the high demand for meat, balancing that with good standards and good welfare standards. And some recognise that a driving force for affordable meat is the societal expectation that for eating meat in the daily diet. So when we asked them what their views were on broiler welfare, 70% either agreed or strongly agreed that they cared about UK broiler welfare, and that was unrelated to their degree of knowledge about poultry production. When asked about what they perceived the standard of UK broiler welfare to be, there was quite a lot of variability in perception. So 38% felt it was poor or very poor, whereas 29% felt it was good or very good, and the more positive views were associated with living in urban environments and consuming more chicken. When we asked focus group respondents what they felt good welfare looked like for a broiler chicken, they were talking around concepts of health, stress, and sort of naturalistic provision. And they felt that the highest welfare systems were organic and free range. We asked them what they thought about slower growing chickens, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they hadn't heard of these. And their initial impressions of slower growing chickens were also quite varied. So some felt slower growing meant that they were more naturalistically produced and was more positive for welfare. Others were a bit concerned about the term, unsure about it, and associated it with sort of marketing strategies. In terms of views on trade-offs with the environment, most people viewed these as really well aligned. They didn't see a conflict between welfare and environmental sustainability, but they generally felt, when we asked them if you had to choose between a high welfare product that produced a greater impact on environmental sustainability or a poorer welfare product that had lower impact on environmental sustainability, the majority prioritised welfare, and their reasons were to do with the sort of personal, tangible and immediate factors associated with that. They felt that sustainability was, again, a marketing term, and they weren't very trusting of what it meant. Those few who were choosing to prioritise environmental aspects tended to cite being a parent to kind of explain this. When we asked them about the citizen-consumer gap, this is where, of great concern to a lot of stakeholders, whereby consumers or citizens, when asked if they will pay more for improvements in welfare, they say yes, but when they actually go and purchase products, that's not consistent with what they purchase. They tend not to purchase higher welfare products. We asked the focus group respondents why that might be. I don't know why this is jumping forwards. I'm really bad with tech. So anyway, we asked respondents why they thought that might be, and they felt that the caveat was that actually people would pay for welfare improvements if they could afford to do so, and they cited that the price gap for higher welfare chicken was quite substantial compared to, for example, the price gap between standard egg and higher welfare eggs, and it was just unaffordable and prohibitive for some. But they also said that it shouldn't actually mean that, though, that there was poor welfare at the standard level. That was really important that good welfare was maintained. And they also expressed quite a lot of cynicism around supermarkets and felt that actually it would be possible to produce improvements in welfare without additional costs to consumers if supermarkets didn't make so much profit. So that we found a number of barriers to improving broiler welfare. Amongst them was that quite a large proportion of people in our survey believed that broiler welfare was good or very good. And this might lead them to think that, well, there's no point in paying an additional amount of money for higher welfare. But unfortunately, we also saw that their knowledge levels were pretty poor, and so it's possible that these beliefs are associated with misconceptions about actual production, and that there's a possible reliance on other parties, such as retailers or brands, to have taken care of the standard of welfare for them, so they don't need to consider this at the point of purchase. My apologies. I think it's on a timer. So another potential issue is I guess the price gap in terms of the difference for higher welfare products is going to be a significant barrier for some. But for others, it might be possible that it's a perceived barrier because they're perceiving that only organic and free range are associated with improvements in welfare. In our focus groups, there was real confusion about assurance schemes and what they represented, and also in terms of welfare labels. And there was a real lack of clarity about what signalled good welfare for a meat chicken as compared, for example, to cage-free for free range. If we're talking about slower growing or welfare environmental improvements, that's much harder for the consumer to understand. And so again, this might be undermining pro-welfare choice in those middle tier labels. We also found that there was quite a surprising degree of distrust of welfare labelling. So, of course, if you don't really trust that higher welfare labelling actually is going to deliver on higher welfare, why buy those products? There was quite a large proportion of people, even though some believed they had capacity to drive change with their purchases, others the majority felt really disempowered, and that their single purchase as an individual would not make a difference in terms of standards of improvements. And another final factor was that several respondents in our focus groups felt that either they or others just simply didn't want to know about the actual standards of poultry production. And as mentioned earlier, this active decision not to find out about standards might actually be a way of reducing cognitive dissonance. So this is a psychological discomfort associated with information that conflicts with your current information, your values or your desired behaviours. So some consumers may feel it's safer not to know about production practices rather than be faced with having to resolve desiring to eat chicken meat with potentially standards that they find unacceptable or don't meet their expectations. So what we can find from this? To reduce consumer confusion, we need to have much simpler messaging in terms of what signals good welfare for meat chickens, and that has to be messaging that's relevant and understandable to consumers, but also aligns well with our scientific welfare metrics that actually evidence that there's improvements in welfare. A lot of brands use different types of messaging to convey pro-welfare information about the same welfare improvements, and so that is adding to the confusion. If we could increase consistency in what signals welfare across labels, that would be beneficial. Understanding why some people feel able and empowered to make changes, make differences with their purchasing, but others do not, would hopefully help to address this barrier. And finally, the price of chicken doesn't reflect the true cost of production. So there's opportunity to better understand why some people are willing to pay a lot for luxury products that don't actually cost much to produce. But not for meat, and that might underpin a change perhaps in marketing strategy which will allow us to align purchase of meat with reduction in meat consumption, and that might address both welfare and sustainability issues. So I'd like to thank everybody involved in the project, my funders, Sainsbury's and Moy Park for our support with the consumer, and all participants. And I'm very sorry about the slides jumping forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. We've just got time for 2 or 3 questions, and I can see there's one there already. Very far away from the aisle. And so if you ask your question while waiting for the microphone.
Yes, thanks very much. I didn't quite understand that line where you said 34% perceive their ability to affect change.
Yes.
What was the result there?
So that was basically asking people whether or not they felt that they have power as consumers to drive change in standards through their purchasing. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit garbled. And that basically showed that most people feel that what they do doesn't really make a difference as individuals, and didn't really sort of conceive of the power as a collective for driving change through their purchasing.
So just before your question, sorry, we've just got one on Slido that sort of links to that. So we've got a question on Slido about how can we engage people, either those people who don't feel empowered or people who just don't want to know, because that is a huge challenge for animal advocates.
I think it is a really huge challenge, and I think I guess part of it will be determined by why a person doesn't want to know. Obviously, some people have no interest in welfare, which might be difficult for some of us to understand, and maybe we're never going to reach those people. Others may not want to know because of the distress, or potentially because it may conflict with things that they want to do, or perhaps feel that they need to do if they've got, a really limited budget and feel that, their only real source of cheap protein is chicken. And I think that there has to be some sort of, there's a number of things that we can do. One is that we can be more clearly signal what welfare improvements are, and as I was saying, which would mean that perhaps even if people's budget means that what's perceived as those higher welfare systems, such as organic and free range, are not achievable by a lot of people, that maybe they could indicate their pro-welfare choice with a smaller improvements that are associated with other assurance schemes. And the other is just sort of demystifying what welfare is in terms of these simple signals, without them having to know all the nitty-gritty any more than I need to know all the nitty-gritty of the standard testing that my car goes through before I decide to buy a safe car.
Thank you. We had a question over there.
First a question. How much, I'm a great fan of slower growing chicken, but still, when I ask my colleagues in genetics, what's the difference between growing 50 grams per day and 65 grams? I don't get a clear answer, also because it seems that the 65 grams people keep on improving things. So can you, as a scientist, tell people a very clear story? Because if you can't do that, then you will have a big communication problem. Why does it matter so much to grow 50 grams rather than 65 grams? Still, they're growing extremely fast.
Yeah.
And the other comment is that there is a solution in Netherlands, as you might know. All the supermarkets have decided that they only sell slower growing, and in essence, it doesn't cost anything. What costs is having separate products lying side by side. So there's a Dutch solution that you can convince supermarkets, and then people don't care, I don't want to hear, they don't have to hear about it, they just go into Marks and Sparks or wherever they go and buy their stuff. So couldn't that be a solution?
Yeah, so my understanding is in the UK, the competition laws prohibit supermarkets all getting together and deciding to just sell one standard. And we have spoken to stakeholders again, who, including retailers, who feel it's their responsibility to make sure that there is affordable protein available for all. And so they feel it's really important to provide choice to consumers. In terms of the evidencing slower growing broilers, we've recently published as part of this project on the difference in between slower growing broilers that are, I guess what you might say, slightly faster, so between 40 grams per day and 59 grams per day. And there's quantifiable differences from our meta-analysis in terms of health-based welfare outcomes. So 15% more, I think, heartburn, 25% more foot bad dermatitis, between 69% and 116% greater mortality in faster growing broilers, and also an increase in lameness. What we don't really have sufficient information for is on the behaviour side of things, which we've seen all today is incredibly important and gives us more of a window into the emotional states of these animals. And what we don't really have enough information on is at a strain level, whether there are strains of birds that have, within the slower growing birds, I'm sure you're aware, there's quite a diversity of slower growing birds in terms of strains as compared to our fast growing strains. So we don't really know which of those best meet both welfare credentials and some of these other problems in terms of the environmental impacts, because they are having impacts because they eat more food, are less efficient, and use more space and energy. So we need to find a happy medium between all those things for it to be feasible. I think hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much. We've just got time for this one last question. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, Ed Bailey, Vet Sustain. Thanks for that. I was really interested that you touched on the functional ignorance as a means of avoiding cognitive dissonance, and also the feeling of disempowerment. And those are both learnt coping strategies for adults, which have also helped people avoid thinking about the climate crisis. And one of the exciting things about development in terms of the climate crisis is the engagement of young people, and we see that in schools. And one of the recommendations from the National Food Strategy was to reorient food right back to the centre of the curriculum. So if our children have a solid understanding of what constitutes good welfare, what labelling means, what is meant by the importance of a balanced diet, where your meat comes from, how it's looked after, and if it's killed in an appropriate way, then that would seem to be a good way of dealing perhaps with that adult cognitive dissonance, because if your kids are asking you for good chicken, you're more likely to go along with that option. I just wondered why dealing with schools and curriculum wasn't part of your recommendations.
Yeah, so I think that's quite complicated in terms of, I guess, implementation. So we have in the past, or I have in the past done work with adolescents actually, and seen very similar patterns of kind of cognitive dissonance and various strategies for simply avoiding having to kind of even find out the provenance, the standards of food, and not even having to sort of be involved in purchasing. I guess I think that it's definitely an important potential strategy, but we also have to be mindful about the mental well-being levels in our young people, which we're seeing increasing problems with, certainly in my experience. And I think in our busy lives with so much going on, that where people are overloaded with information and having to make decisions, this is where they're taking a step back. So I think that even if we do decide that that's an important strategy to educate young people, both in terms of the climate and welfare and all these other crises, that we have to simplify things down in terms of signalling, so that they're not overwhelmed with all the information that they have to juggle to make decisions about. I guess my other concern with young people as well is that we might be educating them in schools, but if their family and their important others hold different views, then that can also be a source of stress in terms of, as a kind of social species, it's very hard for us to hold views that are quite different to those important others. And so that's also something that will have to be dealt with. But I think it's an important point, and perhaps, yes, an omission on my part.
Thank you. So thank you for everyone who asked questions, and if we could just thank Siobhan and Laura in the usual way. Right, there's just going to be a short changeover now, very short. And I'd just like to welcome the chair for the final session of the day, Benjamin Kennedy.